It's so good to be here. Nathan mentioned earlier being at the lake. And Nathan, you got some sun. We can all see that. Yeah, you got some sun there. How many of you guys been to the lake recently? You've been out there. A bunch of you guys. Raise your hand up. You can be proud. It's okay. We like the lake. It's good. Yeah. I'm a water guy. I love going to the lake. It's awesome. And this week, on the end of this week, Friday and Saturday, we've got a friend who, 4 or 5 years ago, said he's got a sailboat that you can it's like a big sailboat. And without knowing that I had no idea how to sail, he said, you guys can use it anytime you want. And so we've been using it, and I've been slowly teaching myself how to sail on this boat, which my family now absolutely hates sailing because of this experience. Like, they hate it, and they're scared to death. It's like there's, roller coasters and dad sailing that are the two most frightening things in their lives. But so with this friend of mine, he's like, let's just use his boat. So Friday night, Sherry and I, one of our daughters, and one of her friends, we were going to go spend the night out on Lake Coeur d'Alene in the boat. And so we go out, and as we were getting ready for the day and kind of wandering around, we were going in the evening, and as the day was going on, I was noticing these dark clouds that were starting to billow up on the west side of Spokane. But here's the deal. The previous week, this friend of mine and I had gone out, and while it was pouring in Spokane, it was sunny in Coeur d'Alene. So I'm just in that happy, blissful place of assuming it's the same this weekend. I was like, you know what? Those clouds aren't headed here. That storm's moving north. Regardless of what the radar says and all of the wind direction, that storm's not going to hit us. So we pack up our stuff. We head over to Lake Coeur d'Alene, and we've just kind of got this thing down to a science. We're going down the dock. We go over to the boat, and we got all our stuff. We're loaded it on, and all the while, I'm just sort of blissfully unaware of what's happening to the west of me. So we get onto the boat, and the girls are they're all excited. We're going to go off to a cove, and they're going to swim and do whatever. And certainly they're asking me, can we not sail today? Because that's just a thing with us. Can we just take the boat out and not sail? Because you're no good at sailing, Dad. That's basically the message I hear. So we're getting the boat ready, and as we're starting to kind of get stuff going, I start the motor, and as I start the motor, it's got the back of this boat, it's a sailboat, so it's not supposed to have a big motor, and ours doesn't. It has a little, there's electric trolling motors, and then there's one notch barely above that, and that's what we have on the back of our sailboat. It's enough to get you out of the marina. So I start the little motor, and it's potting back there behind the boat, and as I'm doing that, I look over, and these clouds that were west of Spokane are now west of Lake Coeur d'Alene. And I see them, it's kind of ominous and dark, but I just still in my mind, I'm like, nah, they're not coming, right? We're good. And so I just back the boat out, and we start putting out, and the sun's still shining, by the way, on the lake. And so, sunglasses on, we're cruising across the lake. We're headed to a cove somewhere to go swim and play. So we're cruising along, and I'm kind of looking out in front of the boat as we're cruising. And then every once in a while, I just thought I should probably just look and make sure the storm's still going north. And I look over my shoulder at this one point, and I realize this storm's not going north anymore. It is definitely coming this way. In fact, it started getting closer and closer to the point where now I'm looking behind the boat as much as I'm looking in front of the boat because I'm yeah, it's coming pretty quick, So at one point, Sherry looks at me and she goes, hey, are we gonna be all right? Is everything gonna be okay? And I said what every guy who is totally unsure and nervous says. I was like, we got this, babe. Like a boss, right? We got this, come on. So we're cruising along, and the girls are they're oblivious. Well, then pretty soon it's dark enough that now it's the sun's starting to get kind of clouded out. We're starting to go in and out of the clouds, and now I'm just cruising along, and we look back. Pretty soon, now we're looking only backwards. And there's this thing, and while we're all looking backwards, including the two girls at the front of the boat, we see this massive lightning come down. And at that point, Sherry looked at me, and I looked at her, and I was like, we got this, we're good. We didn't have this. Let me just say this. At this point, I'm like, we got to go. So I knew there was this one cove with really steep hills on the side of it, really deep and really narrow. I knew I could get in there and be protected from the wind. So I gunned it. So now we're going a full 1 mile an hour faster than we were 10 seconds ago. And I'm like, oh, come on, baby, come on, So now we're cruising, and the storm is definitely moving faster than the boat, and my heart rate is going up. I'm increasing. I'm like, come on, we just got to get there. Meanwhile, every other boat that's anywhere near us is now disappearing because they all go 80 miles an hour at this point, at least relative to us, and every boat is flying across the lake, and here we are helpless as the storm's closing down on us. I know you're wondering, what are we talking about? We're talking about the idea of grace changing everything. Grace, the gospel, changing everything in our lives. But there's this interesting dynamic. Grace does change everything. Grace, the gospel of Jesus, radically changes all of our life. But it requires something. It requires something in order to make a difference in our life. There's a component, there's an aspect, there's an element of life that is absolutely necessary if we ever intend on the grace of Jesus, the gospel of Jesus, truly impacting us. And it's this thing we call community. Community is what the gospel needs. If community is absent from the gospel, then there is no bite to the gospel. The gospel needs something to propel it forward. The gospel needs something. Some of you are like, oh, that's where he was going with the boat thing. The gospel needs something to move it. The gospel needs something to sink its teeth into. The gospel needs something to give motion to it. And how the gospel gets motion, how the gospel is propelled in our lives is through community. And grace changes how we understand and how we experience community. It changes it. So this morning I want to talk about community, the fact that the gospel needs community. The gospel gains traction. The gospel moves forward only in community. Without community, the gospel is just an idea. Without community, the gospel is just this thought that we have. It's just this belief that we hold to. It takes shape. It gets its form. It gets its life from community. Now, we actually see this. We see this whole idea of how God works among people really begin back in the Old Testament. In fact, one of the more famous stories in the Old Testament is the story of the people of Israel being liberated from Egypt. And it's this amazing story of how God works through Pharaoh and through the circumstances and releases the people of Israel out of slavery. And they're released and now wandering in the desert. And we have God beginning to have conversations, meet the people of Israel there. And in those conversations, we start to get a sense of how important community, how important relationship is to God. And I want to just share a couple of things. In Exodus chapter 6, verse 6, one of the early days of this process of Israel being liberated from captivity, God says this. He says, I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you. And then he says, I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. It's really important that we kind of grab a hold of this idea. I'm taking you out of this place, and you will be my people. As the people of Israel wandered, as they were this group sort of forming themselves, now liberated from slavery, they come to Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, they have this incredible, powerful interaction with God. And listen to these words. In Exodus 19, God says this to them. He says, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully, keep my covenant, then out of all nations, you will be my treasured possession. You'll be my people. This is a really powerful thing because not only are we seeing that God works through groups of people and how God forms people, how he calls them to himself, but there's also something even in this story, the story of Egypt, that relates to our story and the grace that God has used to compel us and draw us towards him. If you look at the order of how things happened for the people of Israel, notice how it parallels what we've been talking about in this series. Notice that first, God saves them from slavery. God moves first. God initiates. God rescues them out of their plight. And then everything we read after that is their response to God's mercy and God's grace. It's not the other way around. That's what we've been talking about in this series. Grace changes everything. God moves. God works. God rescues us and saves us. It's not that we obey all the rules, and it's not that Israel obeyed all the rules. It's not that they just jumped through all the hoops, and so God said, well, you've earned the right to be my people. No, God moved in his mercy and his grace, and now these people are responding to that the same way that we respond to it. They were saved by grace, and they committed themselves to God, and they became his people. And God calls them a people. What these people shared in common was this grace experience. They all looked at their story and said, all of us have been rescued, the same way that all of us can look at our story. Those of us who have chosen to follow Christ, we have this common thing where like Israel would point back to the Red Sea being parted and say, remember when God rescued us? All of us can point back and say, do you remember when God rescued us? And it's an us thing. They shared this. And so throughout history, what we see in the Old Testament throughout history is that God has been forging a new community of people. God has been shaping a new humanity of people who follow him, who believe him, who live out life the way he created humanity to live it. And then there's this fascinating connection. We see this in the Old Testament. Then if you turn to the New Testament, the New Testament is comprised of biographies and letters and various things. And when you open some of the letters, actually you see the Apostle Peter wrote a letter to the churches, and you see something. It's fascinating because he's not writing to the Jews. He's not writing even to Jewish Christians. He's writing to people like us. He's writing to people who follow Jesus. But listen to the language that he uses in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. He says this. He says, "You're a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." Doesn't that language sound familiar? So here's Peter in the New Testament using language that sounds eerily similar to the language God was using with Israel out of Egypt, right? You are a chosen people. You're a royal priesthood. You're a holy nation. This whole idea of you. He's not saying they are. He's saying you are. You. It's as if he's saying, Summit Church, you are a chosen people. He's looking at you and he's looking at me and he's saying, this is the language that was traditionally reserved for Israel. I'm now using to describe you. You have this shared experience of rescue. You have this shared experience of living out in grace what God's done in your life. You are a chosen people. And then he continues, he says, you're a royal priesthood. And this is strange, especially when we think about it applying to you and I, because basically what he's saying is, you are a priest. Which I don't know the last time anybody called me, people don't even call me a priest, much less you a priest. When was the last time somebody said, hey, you're a lot like a priest? Says no one ever, right? Like we don't hear these words, especially outside of like maybe the Catholic Church, maybe a Greek, like we wouldn't hear these things, right? And yet he says, you're a royal priesthood. What's he saying when he calls us a royal priesthood? Well, this is fascinating. Think about the role of a priest. And if you've been around church, if you've been around specifically and heard the teachings of the Old Testament and how priests operated in the Old Testament, he's transferring this language. Think about what a priest does, right? A priest is a mediator. A priest is a person who speaks to God on behalf of other people, right? A priest is somebody who goes between. A priest is somebody who brings the needs of people to God. That is historically in the Old Testament what the priest would do. Priests are also counselors, right? Priests are the ones who are deeply involved in the matters of a person's life. Priests are the ones who bring God to the people, not people to God. He delivers and says, this is where you can meet God. Priests are involved in people's lives and they connect people with God historically. And look what Peter says. He says, all of us are priests. We're priests. We are all supposed to be pouring ourselves in involvement and service to the people around us. That's the story of our lives as this people, a chosen people, a holy nation, he continues to say. The word holy is the Greek word hagios. And it's a loaded word. It's loaded because most of us have put all these other ideas on what it means to be holy. Most of us hear holy, and what we think of when we hear holy is we think of somebody who's pious, right? Somebody who's really squeaky clean. They don't ever mess up. That's not the word that's used to describe us. Peter's not saying that you're pious. He's saying you're holy, which means you're set apart. You're different. You're a distinct nation, he says. You are a holy nation. You're a set apart nation. You're a different nation. You have a different nationality. And I love this. I love the way this sort of helps us translate the circumstances and the times that we even live in, especially in America today, because he's not writing to a particular country. And he's not writing to a particular nation of people. He's writing a letter that would be received by a variety of nationalities, a variety of ethnicities, a variety of backgrounds and stories. And he's saying, all of you, with all of this variety, you are a new nation. You're a different kind of nation. The nation is no longer like the nation of Israel that was bound by borders or bound by ethnicity or bound by history. Now you are a new nation, and it is a multinational sort of nation. It is a multicultural nation. It is a nation that is everywhere in every other nation, but is its own distinct nation. You, living in all of these distinct places, are a nation, a holy nation, who lives under the rule of Jesus. That's the distinction. not the government to whom you pay taxes. So God is saying, what he's saying to all of us is, I want you to be a new society in which the world can see exhibited, in which the world can see everything that life with me has the potential to be. We're a holy nation. We're different. We're distinct from the world and people around us. And yet at the same time, we're priests. So there's this sort of conundrum, right? We're different. We're distinct. And yet we're priests, which means we're engaged, we're involved. There is this conundrum, there is this tension, which means that we end up being like Jesus, who was distinct from the world, but also for the world. He was also set in the world to be for the world, to be for people. So there's a difference and there's a forness that's all together in this. That's the sort of community that Paul's describing. When you start thinking about this confronts all sorts of values that we have in our nationality or things that we have in our culture that aren't necessarily things that we got from the Bible. We could probably go on a bunch of rabbit trails and unpack those, but there's one in particular that has implications on the gospel that we're talking about here. And this has to do with our individualism. We're called to respond to the grace of God as a community. You see that in the Old Testament, you see that in the New Testament, you see that throughout the history of humanity, that this nation, this holy people, we're called to respond to the gospel as a community. This isn't as individuals, this is as, like, you can't be a nation by yourself. If you try, the FBI shows up at your house, right? Right? I mean, that's like we're using plural language. You're a people, you're a nation, we're a community. And so we have to understand the centrality of community as a part of the gospel for us to actually begin to live in the benefit, the reality of that gospel. Those things go together. Being a Christ follower means being a part of community. And so there are three things that I want to briefly unpack for you regarding community and why it's so essential. Not only has God been working through community, but God continues to use community in our lives. And this is how. First of all, if you're taking notes, you can jot this one down. First of all, you get to know God in community. You're introduced to God in community. Think about this. When Jesus gathered his disciples, what did he do? Did he meet with them one-on-one? Hey, I just want to tell you who God is. This is just between you and me and nobody else. No, right? Jesus gathered them together and they ate together and they worked together and they talked together and they wandered together. They were together. There was a togetherness about how they grew, which means the most crucial venue for discipleship, for us coming to follow Jesus, to know Jesus, is not what we do individually, but what we do corporately, what we do together. So the very best place for us to take the Word of God and to dissect it, to unpack it, to apply it, to wrestle with it, to struggle with it, is to do it in the context of community. When you think about this, and for so many of you, this is your story. In fact, I would say over and over and over again, this is the story. When Jesus called you to be in relationship with him, he also uniquely called you to be in a community, didn't he? I have a friend, I have one friend who came to know Jesus watching a televangelist in a hotel room when he was a salesman on the road. And even that guy would say, immediately after, God connected him with a community of people. He calls you and always embeds you in community. So our individualism has led so many of us into treating the church like it's like a stadium event, like another sporting event, like another movie we're going to critique and compare notes on and see whether we go again. And that's never what it was intended to be. We're never intended to simply come in, shake hands with the person next to us, say hi, share a couple of interesting facts, and then move out. That's just a crowd. That isn't a community. So the gospel needs more than a crowd. The gospel needs community. You and I, for the gospel to take root in our lives, for us to experience change and transformation, it isn't just us sitting in this room and being a part of a crowd. It's about us being a part of a community. We're a new humanity. We're a new community of people who believe in and know God. That doesn't mean just showing up for church. That doesn't mean we just divide our life between Sunday and then the rest of the week. It means something completely different. Eugene Peterson, in his book, Christ Plays in 10,000 Places, he wrote these words, and I think it's so insightful, so true about all of us. He says, we are a community. We are not ourselves by ourselves. We are born into communities, we live in communities, we die in communities. Human beings are not solitary, self-sufficient creatures. And he's right, isn't he? God is experienced in the presence of others in community. And it's not a particular place or time on Sunday. It is this dynamic of God working among us that we're describing. We experience God in the context of community. We get to know him in the context of community. Secondly, we experience change in community. How many of you have kids? Raise your hand if you have kids. Okay, so the rest of you that don't have kids, you heard your parents say what all of us that raised our hands just have said to their kids. Who are you going out with tonight? Where are you going? Who else is going to be there? Right? As parents, we always want to know that, right? And those of you that haven't had kids, you're always wondering, why did my parents want to know that? Why? Because we're largely shaped by the people we hang out with, right? Like as a dad, I am so concerned about, I see my girls hanging out with people, and I trust my girls, but there's every now and then I'm like that person is going to influence them, right? And so I pray prayers about that. No, I don't do that. But you know what I'm saying? You just watch that, right? Because we're shaped by the people we spend time with. Our primary social community shapes us the most. Our primary social community shapes us the most. Now, here's what's fascinating about Christian community and why it's so different. Jonathan Edwards, who is one of the great American preachers, he said this. Jonathan Edwards said, he said that before we experience the gospel or the grace of Jesus, everything that we do is out of self-interest. So for example, what he talks about is this, that you and I are so desiring a self-image. You and I are so desirous of some sense of self-worth. All of us need some sort of grounding in our life that everything we do is in pursuit of that self-image or that self-worth or that grounding, trying to feel grounded, trying to feel valuable, trying to feel important, right? So we do this. The implication of that on relationships is that before the grace of Jesus, every relationship that we encounter is a relationship that's oriented around our self-image, around our self-worth, around our grounding, which means ultimately that before the gospel, we use people in relationship. We use them. We're trying to get something from them. We're trying to benefit from them. We're trying to do something to increase our worth or our value or our grounding. And so we're leveraging those for our sake. But after the gospel, once we experience the gospel of Jesus, and now our self-worth comes from the gospel. Now our value, our image comes from the gospel. Now our grounding is rooted in the gospel. Now we're suddenly liberated and we respond in relationships differently. Now we can live in relationships for others, not for ourselves. We can actually enjoy conversation for the sake of another person, not for the sake of our own goodness, right? So there's this dynamic that's taking place. We relate to people differently because of the gospel, which means there's this crazy relationship that happens. The gospel makes us the kind of people that can live in a particular kind of relationship in a particular kind of way. And those relationships then forge and shape our hearts to become more robust in the gospel. And there's this relationship between the two. The gospel makes us easier people to live with, better people to be friends with. The gospel encourages this dynamic in community. And then we become a particular kind of person because of that. So there's a relationship between the two. So this means this: if you want the gospel to change you, like if you've come to the gospel and you know that you have idols in your heart, or you've come to the gospel and you know that you have these insecurities, you know that you have these things that you chase after, if you come to the gospel and know that you actually need God, then that also means you need to be in relationship with people where you're sharing life, where you share struggles, where you confess your brokenness, where you eat meals together, where you laugh together, where you make decisions together, where you fight together. You need to have those things. You need to learn together, wrestle with scripture together. Until you have those relationships in your life, the gospel will never take bite. It will never propel you forward until you're living in that kind of relationship. It was true for Israel. It was true for the early church. It's true for us. In fact, the one another passages in the New Testament, they're sprinkled throughout the New Testament. How we live towards one another, they're this beautiful expression of something that goes beyond a crowd. Listen to these things. Throughout the New Testament, you hear these words, that we need to honor one another. We need to serve one another, offer hospitality to one another, encourage one another, accept one another, bear with one another, admonish one another, teach one another. We're to love one another. That's the sort of community that we have to learn to be. Not just individuals pursuing God in the presence of other individuals, but a community pursuing God in the presence of a community. Life Together, Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote these words. He said the first service that one owes to others in the fellowship consists in listening to them. Just as love to God begins with listening to his word, so the beginning of love for others is learning to listen to them. Listening can be a greater service than speaking. There's an others orientation. There's a communal dynamic of the gospel. And we are changed through community, which means it's possible for us to have a dramatic, emotional, individual experience with Jesus and really not experience transformation apart from community. It explains why we can have these emotions towards the cross and yet not really be changing and growing because we're not engaged in gospel community. So why is community important? First of all, because you know God. You experience God. Secondly, because you experience change. And then lastly, because you impact the world in community. So, here's what's funny. We think of, and this is kind of like, I don't know, that's stuff I geek out on, which I'll just admit to, but we often think of the gospel, or we think of community as a result of the gospel. In the same way that like Israel shared the experience of grace of being rescued from Egypt, made them a group, like, oh, we share this. The same way community is something that's a result of the gospel. It's true. That is a very true thing. But community is also an expression of the gospel. It also shows the gospel. It also communicates the gospel to a watching world. And here's why. Community, watching people together, shows the world something that they want to be a part of when it's done rightly. This sailboat that my friend has that we use, it's at this marina, and the first time we showed up, I've never been a marina person. I've never, I like the lake and I've launched boats, but I've never been in a marina until this experience of this friend letting me use his boat. And the first time I went, I noticed there was an in crowd at the marina. And you could identify the in crowd because they had really leathery, dark skin from baking raisins in the sun all day long. They would sit out there. And I remember when we first showed up, these people, I don't even think they take their boats out, by the way. They just sit on the dock and face each other and talk about their boats, but they don't drive their boats. And they have barbecue grills and all their stuff. It's like they're home away from home. There's a couple of people at this marina, I swear, I think they've never left. I think they've been there for the whole 5 years. They're just frozen in the winter and crispy, extra crispy Kentucky Fried Chicken in the summer. Truly the darkest people you've ever seen. They're barely coherent, most of them. But this last time we showed up, we were walking down and we got our thing down, we're walking down and suddenly this group I always felt alienated from, they were like, hey, how's it going? Suddenly we were welcomed and Now, I looked at my skin to make sure, I was am I really leathery or something? What's going on? I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but suddenly we're in, baby, we're in. They actually want to talk to us, right? We've all had that experience, right? We look at a group of people and we go, that group, they're having fun. That group, they relate to each other. That group, there's just something about the dynamic that's going on, and there's this longing, man, I wish I was a part of that. That is a human experience that all of us have. It doesn't matter how cool you are. Every person has at some point thought, I want to be a part of that group because they look like they're having fun together. They look like they're doing life together a way I would desire. That's what the gospel creates. The gospel creates a compelling, attractive, wonderful community that should cause others to say, I want to be a part of that. I want to experience that. I want to know what those people know. And when the world sees exceptional community, when the world sees an exceptional community, it makes the world want to be a part of it. And so the gospel forms community, but the gospel also creates a community that expresses the gospel. When people look and they see us living this life-giving thing out together, and they see us being generous and others-oriented, there's something about it that's just compelling. There's something compelling about a group of people who see things differently and interact differently. People who, rather than seeing money as something that's leveraged for themselves, see money that's an opportunity to serve and help other people. A group of people who approach things like sexuality rather than a means by which we have our own needs met, instead as a means to experience intimacy in the context of marriage. For a group of people who don't see power as something to be grasped and held onto and leveraged for control, but as something that's given away to bring justice and mercy into broken situations. When people see people living that way, it's beautiful and it's attractive and they want to be a part of it. And that's the kind of community the gospel creates. Not only that, when people see us together and we're all so different with all of our stories, with all of our experiences and our backgrounds and our political views and all the things that we don't share, there's something beautiful about that. Something beautiful about people who can get along and not be identical to each other. Look around the room for a moment. You realize how strange it is for this group of people to be together? Coug fans make sense, right? We can get Coug fans together. We can get Dog fans together. We can get Mariner fans together. But you look at this group and it's just like, what gets us together is the gospel, and there is nothing like the gospel. There's this unity that removes the racism and the classism and the cultural imperialism. There's something that happens in the gospel. In fact, Jesus, in John chapter 17, there's a prayer that Jesus was praying that John recorded, and Jesus was praying for his disciples, but he was also praying for the church in the future. And so it's a beautiful prayer, and I encourage you to read it at some point. But in verse 23 of John 17, he says this. He says, "May they be brought to complete unity to let the world know that you sent me and have loved them as you have loved me." It's an amazing thing. He says, may they be brought to complete unity. May our unity be so compelling. May our unity be so overwhelming that the world would know that you sent me. Basically what Jesus is saying, this is amazing. He's saying that the main way that people will believe that he really came is that Christians have found this unity. Like the thing that's most compelling is this unity. The thing that's most beautiful, most unexplainable, that people will believe Jesus because you and I are so unified. He says that's the thing. Not because of our judgment, not because of our Facebook rants, not because of the things we condemn or don't. What Jesus says is compelling to people is our unity. It's our one anotherness. That's what's compelling. And the quality of our community is the real secret sauce to what it means to be a Christ follower. The quality of our community is not the size of the crowd that gathers. It doesn't matter how big this building ever gets. That's not what's compelling. What's compelling is who are we? What is the quality of our unity? What is the quality of our community? Because we are a sign. We are showing people what it looks like to live the gospel out. We are an example. We are a new humanity. We, Summit Church, is a chosen nation, a royal priesthood. We are this. So we know God in community. We experience change in community, but then our community tells a story to a watching world. So the question about this for all of us is, where are you with community? Where are you with this community thing? Do you have people in your life? Are you engaged? Are you in community groups? Are you serving in some capacity? Are you in some sort of relationship? Do you have the sort of embedded relationships with people where you're sharing your struggles and you're holding each other accountable and you're wrestling with reality? Are you experiencing community in this sort of way? Are you connected? Are you living out the gospel? Is your primary source of influence people who share the same beliefs in the gospel as you? I know for me, I have to be intentional about this. I've got a few friends over the last couple of years. The last year and a half, there's two guys in particular that I've sat down with. And after periods of time together, I've just said, you have permission to ask me any question. This one friend recently, I just sat down and said, you have permission to ask me any question ever in my life. If there's anything you ever want to ask me, you have full permission to ask me. You have full access to all of my life. Why do I ask another man to have that sort of access into my life? Because I believe in community. I believe in gospel community. I believe that I grow and experience God and show people something by living that sort of way with other people. And not only do I want that for you, but God wants that for you. That's what he's been doing from the beginning, forming and shaping a new humanity. Will you be a part of that? Let's pray together. Would you stand with me? Jesus, this morning we pray that you take us deeper. Deeper than just beliefs and ideas, deeper than just answers to questions, but into community, into real life, into relationship. Lord, I pray that we would be something as a church that people look at and say, man, I want to be a part of that. I pray that we would model a unity and a love and a bearing with one another and a caring for one another, Lord, that just causes the people that are watching to say, that's different and that must be Jesus. We love you and we're so grateful we get to be a part of this. And I pray all these things in your name. I've done something today that I rarely ever do, and that's I've ended almost early today. On purpose, because it's so easy to come in and out of here and see people you even know and be like, hey, what's going on? How's it going? But today I just want to encourage you with this. Before you leave today, would you just take an extra minute? Would you shake somebody's hand? Would you engage? Would you see how somebody's doing? Would you not settle for surface, but would you dive deeper into community and take this morning to do that? So would you do that with me? That'd be good. You guys agree? It's a good thing. 8 or 9 of you, that's awesome. So may you break the curse and the bondage of individualism. May you experience community, and in that community, may you know God, may you know change, and may you be a light to the watching world. Amen? Amen. All right, hang out, talk to each other for a little bit, and we'll talk to you guys next Sunday.